The Circuit, Stories from the Life of a Migrant Child by Francisco Jimenez. Chapter El Ángel de Oro for Miguel Antonio. It always rained a lot in Corkin during the cotton season, but that year it rained more than usual. No sooner had we arrived from Fowler, where we had picked grapes, than it started to pour. Our cabin was one of several farm worker shacks lined up in a row, behind which ran a small creek. There was not a lot to do when it rained. We stayed indoors telling ghost stories when we heard from other migrant workers. We also played guessing games. When I got tired of listening to the same stories told many times before, I watched our neighbor's goldfish. From our window, I could see into the next cabin, where a fishbowl sat on a small table. I spent hours glued to our window watching that goldfish glide in slow motion, stirring in the jade-green plants with its delicate fins. Mom enjoyed watching it too. She called it El Ángel de Oro. Papa passed most of his time worrying. He smoked one cigarette after another and complained about the rain because we could not pick cotton when it was wet. If the rain doesn't stop, we'll have to leave and find work somewhere else, he repeated, pacing up and down the floor. Even the thought of rain gave him a headache. Luckily for me, I got to go to school the following week. Monday morning, after getting Mama's blessing, I headed for school, which was only about a mile from the cotton labor camp. I could see it from where we lived. On the way, I met Miguelito, who lived in the same labor camp. He was 2 years older than I and had started school for the first time that year a month earlier in October. He took me to the main office and translated into Spanish some of the questions the principal had asked me. Before I was led into my third grade class, Miguelito and I agreed to meet on the playground after school and walk home together. Miguelito was already waiting for me when I got to the playground. When we started walking toward the labor camp, following the same route we had taken that morning. The path was muddy and full of puddles, just like the school playground. Miguelito and I imagined the puddles were lakes, and we pretended to be giants stepping over them. We counted out loud the number of lakes we stepped over, trying to outdo each other. Miguelito had longer legs than I, but I kept up with him until I slipped and lost my balance. My right foot landed right in one of the puddles, splashing muddy water on my clean overalls and on Miguelito. The cardboard inside my shoe got soggy and started to fall apart. Once I collected myself, Miguelito and I began laughing. We continued walking, but every time we looked at each other, we would start laughing again. This went on until we arrived at the labor camp. As we approached our cabin, I knew no one was home because our carcachita, our old jalopy, was not parked in front. Want to come in? I asked. I have to go home first, he answered. I'll come back in a little while. I'll be in the back by the creek, I said. Don't forget, our cabin's number 10. I live 10 cabins down from you, number 20, Miguelito replied cheerfully. I went inside our cabin. It was cold and quiet. I went over to our window to look at our neighbor's goldfish. I watched it swim back and forth. I wonder if he gets lonely, I thought to myself. I then went behind our cabin and sat on a rock by the edge of the creek. I listened to the water murmur and watched the little gray fish play with each other. The current gently tugged at the plants growing in the water. I picked up some pebbles and tossed them in one at a time, trying not to hit the fish. What are you doing? Asked Miguelito, coming up behind me and making me jump. Oh, I'm just watching the little fish while I wait for my parents to get back from work. Do you want to catch some? Catch what? I asked. Fish, tonto, he replied, chuckling. Well, before I could answer, he jumped up like a grasshopper, ran over to a small pepper tree that was a few yards away, and yanked off 2 branches. These are our fishing poles, he said excitedly, handing one over to me. Tomorrow I'll bring the other stuff and we'll finish making them. That night it poured again, and in the morning the rain turned to drizzle. I put my hat on and walked out the door, hoping to meet Miguelito so we could walk to school together. I could not wait to catch fish with him in the afternoon. But he did not show up, and I did not see him at school all day. When I returned home from school that afternoon, I went to see if he was waiting for me by the creek. He was not there either. Then I remembered his cabin number. I hurried over to number 20 and knocked on the door. No one answered. I went around to the side of the cabin and peeked through the window. The cabin was completely empty. My heart sank into my stomach. Slowly, I walked home feeling a lump in my throat. I heard Miguelito's laugh in my head, and I thought about our game and with the puddles. When I got home, I stood by our window and stared at our neighbor's goldfish for the longest time. Finally, my family arrived. They had spent all day driving around looking for work. It rained so much that night that the creek flooded into the dirt streets, making the cabins look like they floated on a lake. Then, days later, when the clouds disappeared and the sun emerged, the lake began to split into hundreds of small puddles throughout the Labor Canyon. One day, on my way home from school, I discovered little gray fish in the puddles. I had no idea how they got there. But I noticed that in the smaller puddles, the fish were dying. The mud was suffocating them. As I gazed at the dead fish, the image of the goldfish flashed in my mind. I quickly ran to our cabin and got the empty Hill's Brother coffee can. I filled it with water and began picking up the dying fish from the mud puddles, putting them in the can and dumping them into the creek. After a couple hours, I was exhausted. There were too many, and I could not work fast enough to save them all. I prayed for rain, but the sun kept beating down, turning the puddles into mud. I picked up one last small dying fish and took it to our next-door neighbor who owned the goldfish. I knocked and knocked on the door until my hand hurt and no one was home. I placed a coffee can on the front steps and peered inside. The little gray fish looked up at me, rapidly opening and closing its mouth. That evening, I looked through the window into our neighbor's cabin. The goldfish swam peacefully alongside the little gray fish. I sighed and smiled to myself. The next morning, I took the fishing rod Miguelito had given to me, placed it gently on the creek, and watched it float away.